Welcome to the Neutral Ground Podcast. This week, my guest is writer, podcaster, and business owner, Nick Gibson. Nick is the founder of Phoenix Press, a comic book publishing house. Additionally, he also writes for and manages the team behind the two comics that we're going to discuss in this episode, Project Axis and 2100 Samurai. For our conversation, we touch upon topics that range from the inspiration to create comics, and the feeling that you have something creative inside of you that needs to get out into the world. We also discuss the art of character development and what it means to write trusting people. We also spend a bit of time talking about the importance of freedom of speech for writers as well. I hope you enjoy my conversation with Nick Gibson. Nick, thank you for being here.
Pleasure to be here. Happy to have you on. Sorry, I pulled that.
It's totally fine. It's great. Nick, do us a favor and tell us a little bit about your first experiences with comics and kind of what drew you to those things, those specific storylines.
Well, I've been a lifelong fan of the media. But in terms of like specific comics that have kind of drew me in, I'd probably say the new Teen Titans, in particular the Marv Wolfman George Perez run, is really what was kind of what got me into comics, like full stop. I've always been a fan of like Batman, Nightwing, Titans, a little bit of X-Men, and some Spider-Man here or there. It's just, I guess as far as what draw me in, I guess the heroics and the valiant pageantry, if I was feeling poetic.
Well, yeah, I mean, this idea of heroism, my audience knows I'm always talking about heroism, and part of my own research actually dives into how we narrate heroism, which is why I love comics and why I wanted to speak with you today and have you on for my audience as well. Maybe I can ask you then, why do you think it's so important that we have heroes, especially today?
Well, there's always kind of been a need for heroes throughout history. I mean, look at Greek mythology. It's basically just a comic book pantheon, if you think about it. There's always kind of been, whether it's, the 12 Labors of Hercules, that might as well be a 12-issue story arc right then and there. Not just Greek mythology, Roman, Egyptian. All cultures have their mythical heroes, whether it be Thor, Shiva, or even like all the Japanese monsters that fables. We have always, we as a culture, as a race, have always kind of like used stories as a medium to exchange information. Like, for example, in Japanese mythology, there's a kappa, which is kind of like near rivers, and it takes children who go close to rivers. The whole purpose of that story is to make sure the kids don't play near rivers. And I kind of fascinating that they use the method of stories, or even like the Grimm fairy tales, Hansel and Gretel, all those other ones. We communicate morals, messages through stories. I mean, that's the reason why we have a whole thing called oral tradition.
Yeah, absolutely. And in some ways, comics have, especially for the past, let's say, 100 years or so, comics have been the one place that has been able to keep the importance of those stories, right? To keep those values. They still always seem to provide us today with some sense of the hero and why it's important for us to have that kind of belief in heroism as well. So yeah, I think you're probably right about a lot of what you said there. Well, let's dive into your own work a little bit here. And I read Project Axis, and I loved it. And specifically, I don't want to give away too much because I want our listeners to get their own copies and enjoy it. But the first thing I want to ask you about with it, though, is it kind of opens up in a really mysterious way. The hero doesn't quite know what's going on, but Giles, as we know him right now, Giles feels like he needs a sense of purpose. Like that's the first thing that he has to do is find purpose. What do you think it is about that particular storyline in humanity that we keep returning to it? This idea of needing to find purpose.
Well, it all kind of comes back to the eternal question. What is the meaning of life? And to be perfectly frank, the answer is whatever you want it to be. That's my personal opinion anyway. And that's every person who's ever lived has at one point asked themselves the question, what is the meaning of life? What is my purpose for being on this floating rock in space? There's nothing more tragic than a meaningless existence. We want to believe that our time on this planet had meaning.
Yeah, and there's a almost a special kind of horror in having that meaningless existence, right? Like in some ways, many of us, if not all of us, have had moments maybe where we've questioned our purpose and or what is the purpose, let's say. And I think we can all agree that those are not particularly good moments for us, right? Purpose drives us to be better, to look for better things in ourselves and better things in each other as well. I'm curious.
It's the reason why so many people join cults or... Oh, sorry, I was talking over you.
No. You're good. We can go in that way as well. It connects very much with what we're saying too, this idea of cults, because what is it that cults are able to do for people is provide story, right? And purpose.
Provide meaning, provide existence, provide community. And cult leaders particularly prey on those type of people.
Absolutely. Yeah, and it's strong. It's such a strong pull when you don't have meaning in your life. If for anyone who can offer you, we'll use the term easy and easy access to meaning. If someone can offer that to you, we can certainly understand why someone would take it. And so I think you're right that maybe also what we're talking about here too is that pull of narrative structure and meaning is so powerful that we are willing, many of us, to give up our own personal narratives and structures if we have someone there who can provide maybe a more stable one in the moment. I'm curious about with our character here, our hero, Giles. Can you tell us a little bit about where that character came from with you? What were you thinking about when you started creating the character?
Well, Giles, I'm going to be a bit honest. He's a bit of a self-insert. The story is semi-autobiographical. I'm not saying I can do all those amazing things, but just kind of like the things that drive him, it's kind of a wish, kind of a thing. So I put a lot of myself into that character and kind of like, thoughts and dreams and hopes and kind of just my measure of reality, if you will.
And I mean, that's how we relate to other people as it is, right? We think about ourselves first, we engage ourselves in some kind of reflection, and then we use that understanding of ourselves to gain access to others, to interact with others. So I'm not surprised that there's a part of you in Giles here. Was it a difficult character to come up with? In other words, did you have to really reflect a lot on yourself before you could put that, let's say, pen to paper, even though it probably wasn't a pen, but still?
Well, more fingers to keyboard. Because the interesting thing, and this kind of informs a lot of the character, Project Axis was created right after I graduated from high school in like 2006, 2007. So it was kind of that kind of era of me that kind of informed the core of Giles. Me like 10 plus years ago is really who Giles is. Kind of the person just graduating from high school, kind of in that limbo of like, I'm going to go to schooling, but I haven't gone yet, kind of thing. And like not knowing where I want to go, what I want to do, and being pulled in these different directions and kind of wishing just for a clean slate and just, an arrow pointing and say, go this way.
And what was it like to actually see something that came from you finally hit the pages or become alive and get birthed out to the public? What was it like that first time you saw that comic?
I swear it was as if the comic was emitting light. Because even though I created it and a lot of these issues were written 10 plus years ago, it wasn't until only really a few years ago that Project Axis did come to fruition. And when I first held that comic, around 2018 or so, it was like, it's kind of like that kind of feeling.
Yes.
And I had a similar feeling with my second comic book, Torrent Samurai. When I held that one, it was a very similar feeling. It was kind of like the long fought road is finally over. I did it, kind of thing.
And did you have times during that period where you thought, either you thought this isn't going to happen, or you know what, forget it, I give up? Did you have those times there?
I mean, for the longest time, I had given up on Project Access. It was kind of, I was still attached to that company, but it was kind of in limbo. It was only really an opportunity came up where the owner, he was trying to do another push for his company, and I had an artist that I had worked with on a previous project, not related to comics, but that was more in the video game field, and he was willing to come on, and it just kind of happened from there, and all the pieces kind of fell into place, but it was like 10 plus years I had to wait before I even got my shot.
And how did you keep yourself, because I think this is a story that a lot of people need in their lives to hear, how did you keep yourself then motivated to stay attached, even though you said it wasn't really there? You had that moment where you were like, this isn't going to happen. There must have still been a part of you that felt like, you know what, this needs to get out there, though. How did you keep yourself motivated to do that?
Well, honestly, it's just the owner and me had kind of developed a friendship, and that's kind of what really kind of kept us together those years. I kind of pursued other things, like I tried to go to college for animation. That didn't really work out. I mean, I got an associate's degree, but didn't really pursue it beyond there. It was still kind of on my mind here and there, but it was really, I was attached to this video game project, and then that kind of didn't go that well, and then when the comics, that's kind of what set me on this path, and I started writing again, I kind of like, hey, I forgot how good I am at this, it's like, I'm, blah, 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 and then, I left the company, and that kind of just gave me lit the fire under my belly to be like, I'm going to do this, and that's kind of, I've been riding that train since.
You said you leaving the company lit that fire in you. Is that even to a degree your kind of moment of kind of call to heroism, that now this is on you? You got to go do this yourself.
Yeah. The way that it kind of happened, it's a bit, are you familiar with there's an episode of Futurama where like Bender's doing like a theme park. He's like, I'm going to create my own theme park with blackjack and ladies of the night. I'm trying to keep this PG.
Exactly. But it's one of my favorite lines.
So
yes, go ahead.
So basically my marching motto was, I'm going to create my own company with blackjack and, and so that was basically my marching motto,
yes.
Blackjack and blah, blah, blah,
Yes, I know the exact
and that
line.
was basically my rallying cry.
That's fantastic.
I know,
wonderful.
I'm just trying to keep this PG. I'm trying to keep this PG. So,
I appreciate it, but those people who know the line that you're referring to absolutely are laughing with us. Yes, because they know that the sentiment there. That's fantastic.
So it's like, that was my rallying cry. That was my rallying cry.
That's great. It's so, it's so difficult too, because we all have these kind of, I guess sometimes they're called these gut check moments when you have to, everything seems so low in the hero's journey to a degree, and you have to find a way to keep that idea alive and to keep moving forward, even if it's only you're the only one who believes in that idea. So it sounds to me like you really were able to keep that going, and that's pretty wonderful.
Yeah, I kind of liken it to life forcing me down a certain path, because even leading up to this, I was getting really frustrated, and I was talking with my artist about forming my own company. Like, so it's not like this idea was new to me. Even before I left the company, the talk had been had. But my thing was like, you know what? I'm gonna stay here, learn some more, and when I'm ready, I'm gonna do it. But life decided, you know what? You're ready now. Boom.
Yeah, and sometimes we need that.
And turns out I was.
Yeah, and I wanna talk with you about your company as well, Phoenix Press. Let me ask a couple more stories about this, about the Project Access story, though. Something that stood out to me was you have at the very beginning two characters, Joe and Phil. And not to give too much away
Mm-hmm.
about them, but what I found to be interesting was normally when we have kind of heroic characters who are trying to find their way, there's a high level of distrust in others. And yet something about Joe and Phil, these two characters, Giles trusts them right away. And I'm curious, do you have a thought behind going that route by saying, I want to have this kind of trust right away as opposed to the usual distrust? Was there anything behind that?
I mean, I would like to claim that I'm some thoughtful artiste and say, oh, I have this grand plan and I had this whole thought process, but no, I needed to move the story forward, and that's how I chose to do it. And it's really as simple as that. I'm not gonna claim to be something I'm not.
No, that's totally fine. Absolutely. And it
But
just...
I will say this though.
Yeah, go ahead.
Phil and Joe are actually based off of my real life grandparents, so that did kind of inform a lot of their characterization. Was my real life grandparents.
Well, that's fantastic. That's great that you found, and I mean, I think most people do this. Most people who write and who have some sort of creative medium, again, they look to themselves, right, to some degree, and they take from what life has shown them. So you can see that kind of, there's a beautiful kind of intimacy between the two of them, between Joe and Phil, that you can see right away. You can almost sense why a stranger would find them to be very trustworthy. They're very caring in that way. Is that the element that you wanted to come through most of all? You think, is that caring?
Yes, kind of like that elderly, kind of like taking in, caring for someone, like that kind of element. It's a bit of a trope in fiction, I'll admit, like lost amnesiac hero gets taken in by elderly couple and kind of nursed back to health. I mean, it's a bit of a trope, but it's one that I actually kind of really like.
You're right in a lot of ways that there's a trope there about it, but there's also a common theme today too of cynicism as well, and a kind of distrust of others, right? And I think maybe that's why it spoke to me more than you might have even thought at the time when you had written it back then, was because there's something beautiful about it today. And of course, you couldn't have known this back then, but today, when we seem to be so distant, both, for pandemic reasons and just in general at times distant, having that image of those two, of that loving couple, the caring couple, does bring a sense of hope, at least a little bit, where maybe you didn't even know you were doing that.
Interesting. Never really thought about it that way. It does kind of make me feel happy to bring joy to people.
We never know when we're doing that, but it doesn't always happen. But I would say in that, for me reading this comic, it did hit me a certain way of how wonderful it is to feel that trust in others, that trust in strangers, because very quickly they do establish that caring connection with Giles. And it's not something that to me comes across as simply a way to move plot. I think you did a better job than you give yourself credit for here in terms of making it a believable moment with the way they speak to him.
I've always kind of placed an emphasis on naturalistic dialogue. Like I kind of look towards like Quentin Tarantino and how he kind of writes dialogue where it's very kind of more, it flows really well and people, it just kind of feels more like people, because the problem I have with a lot of movies is these characters talk like screenwriters instead of actual people. The way they talk, it just feels very unnatural. And in some movies that's fine, but in a movie where it's set in our world and it's supposed to be realistic to a degree, I want my characters to talk like people, and that's kind of really where I feel Quentin Tarantino really shine. I mean, that's kind of what one of the things he's most famous for is Quentin Tarantino dialogue.
And it does. It comes across very natural, the dialogue, and connects well, I think, with the reader. Well, let me ask you a little bit about not giving away too much, but what can readers who want to keep up with the comic, what can they kind of expect in terms of the feel of the comic or trajectory of it? What can they expect as they continue with this story?
Well, the first story arc is about four, maybe five issues long, and it basically you'll basically see Giles kind of go on a journey, like kind of like the initial journey to find his creator, the man behind the project, if you will. And some things happen, and then going forward, he may fall in with a group that's trying to take down Nebula Corporation, and for them it kind of becomes a bit of a spy caper, corporate espionage kind of book. I'm talking very generic broad strokes here, but
Sure.
that's kind of where things are heading.
Great. Okay. And in terms of your second comic as well, which I also had the pleasure of reading here, Samurai 2100, right? That has a very different feel to it, but something that right away struck me was this character of the village lore master. Can you tell me? I know he doesn't show up for very long, but I find that concept to be really interesting. Can you tell us a little bit more about that, about what that character means?
Well, the thing is, I say Songor is like a province, a fantasy fictional province of, kind of like a province of Japan, and it is, but at the same time, it isn't. And I'm just gonna kind of leave that kind of branch
Sure.
there for people to chew on. But yeah, it's he's kind of there. He knows more than about what's going on with the village and the surrounding area more than they do. That'll kind of be revealed in the future issues and whatnot.
And is the idea that the lore master, is it kind of what it sounds like to a degree, that it's someone, I think in the comic you say that he curates ideas or curates the stories. Is that something that you think that we could use more of today? Because I mean, the human being has always collected stories, right? For thousands of years. We've been collecting stories, and we've already talked a bit about
look
it.
at both of us. We have bookshelves.
Oh yeah, I mean, look, I am definitely the lore master of the basement here. I'm definitely a collector of stories, and again, maybe you didn't think at the time, but it struck me as something, because we create so much content today as a species, more than we ever used to be able to, between social media, between the internet, between digital ways of collecting stories. And yet, I wonder, is there something to be said for someone who can curate all of these ideas and create a meaningful, coherent story for us?
I mean, yes and no, but my fear is you assign one person to curate stories. Depends on what their definition of curate is. Because if you curate is deciding what comes in, what goes out, I'm always kind of fearful of like one person deciding what information is valid, what information isn't. For me, all information is necessary for the human condition.
Mm-hmm.
Like it's like, it's because I'm a very big believer. Those who do not learn from history are doomed to repeat it. It's like we shouldn't bar people from any sort of information, but instead we should teach people how to disseminate the information. Like it's like the age-old argument. Like for example, like I'm gonna enact Godwin's Law here, Mein Kampf. Like, yes, it's a horrible book, but people should have access to it so they know what exactly the ideology they're talking about. If we ban this stuff, and there's also the thing of like, when you ban something, you make it more alluring.
Mm-hmm.
This is kind of a tangent of it, but like, for example, in Germany, the drinking age is technically 18, but like people 14 or so can drink. Their rates of alcohol consumption are a lot lower among teens, because if you take out the allure of it, the taboo of like, oh, I'm 16 years old and I'm drinking, people are a lot less likely to consume it. So it's like, if you make information freely available, people are not going to be as enticed by it. Like, ooh, I want to get this banned information.
Yeah, and you're absolutely right in that one of the things we pride ourselves on, of course, as Americans, is the idea of free speech, and that, of course, doesn't limit itself to the things that only you agree with. It has to be open
Mm-hmm.
for the speech of things that you disagree with, and maybe even more so, because it's the idea of we have to be able to have these conversations in a way that is meaningful. And you made me think of, and I'm going to butcher the quote, forgive me, but the quote of, when you cutting out a man's tongue doesn't prove him to be wrong or prove him to be a liar. It proves him to be someone who's telling the truth. And how the idea
That's a
of,
Game of
if you,
Thrones quote.
is that what it is? Yeah, I came across it.
Yeah, it's Tyrion. He says, when you cut out a man's tongue, you're not proving him a liar. You're proving that you're afraid of what he has to say.
That's it. Yes. Oh, I didn't even know that. That's where it came from. It's a great quote, and it's something that pops into my mind every so often because of the idea of what you said, that you can elevate something by trying to suppress it to the highest level of truth, because you're challenging others to engage it in a way that maybe they wouldn't have even engaged it if you just let it out. Let it happen, let the discourse happen, and see how people respond to it.
The purpose of free speech is not to allow all speech to have its place, but the purpose of free speech is that so you can challenge any source of speech. So by allowing one thing to be talked about, one thing another, in essence, you're not banning this. You're more allowing this to reign unchecked. That's kind of how I see it.
Yeah.
You have A and B. You bring together, they clash. It's not that one has defeated the other. What happens is that they kind of merge it into something better. Not A or B, but it turns into C. That's how ideas have kind of shaped themselves throughout humanity. Is we've had open discourse, we've challenged ideas, we've put thought into them, and in the end, it's not that one idea won out of the other. It's the best parts of both ideas merge to create something even better.
Well, you just basically said the entire ethos of my podcast, of Neutral Ground. The idea being, if we can stay in the middle, we can pull great ideas from either side, any side that you want. And that's really what we need to do, is pull from the best and come together as a species. Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And when I mentioned the curating part, I think what I was thinking about is, how do we pull together great stories that continually motivate us to further humanity and to be the best versions of ourselves? And maybe that's a great lead-in to ask you a little bit about your company here. I still want to talk about Samurai 2100, but I think that's probably the best lead-in here, because in a way, as the owner, you are going to curate stories, and you're going to have a specific, let's say, kind of ethos for your company. What can people who want to be a part of your company in terms of supporting it, reading the comics, what can they expect from your company, from the stories that come out of Phoenix Press?
Well, when it comes to my stuff, I try to keep my comics as apolitical as possible. I don't like to bring in any sort of sometimes I'll touch upon some controversial issues, but nothing too polarizing. I try to write people. I don't for me, when they say how do you write, character from X race, X gender, or whatever, write them as people first. That's always been my ethos, if you will, is people are people. It doesn't matter if they're black, white, women, gay, whatever. People are people. And basically you write them as such. But when it does come to race, I always try to be very careful with how I portray them, because I do realize my skin color and my ethnicity does kind of, I might be ignorant about stuff, so I tend to ask people who I know, hey, am I writing this character culturally correct? Because I don't want to, kind of step on any toes. I try to be, careful. But for me, as a creator, I do feel it is my duty to not just have a bunch of white men and women running around my comics. So I kind of feel me as a creator, it's kind of my duty to put more people of color into my comics, characters, heroes, and whatnot. Just to more reflect our actual world.
Sure. And do you, well, that also takes me into Kiro here with Samurai as well. You mentioned about writing about characters. What was the mindset behind Kiro's story?
He's kind of like your stereotypical hero and whatnot, where it's like he's gallant, he's brave and whatnot. He's reasonably intelligent. He's not like he's a dummy. But the thing is, when he comes to this 2100 world, he's kind of naive. Yeah, he can kick people's butts, and he's very capable in terms of fighting. But navigating the social currents, he is like a fish out of water. And so, like, there's a character that I introduced called Tyler, who you'll see, like, kind of like in issue 1 and then more prominent in issue 2, where they kind of, like, are different sides of the coin, where Tyler can't really fight, but she's very street smart. Whereas Kiro, he can fight, but, like, he might get stopped by the cops and arrested. So it's like they fill each other's void, if you will.
And yeah, Kiro is definitely kind of it's kind of the fish out of water story, and it's a very dark world that he comes into. And I think something I wanted to ask you about was, this is maybe a human thing as well as a writer thing. Why do you think it is that when we tend to write about the future, we tend to look at it as a kind of dystopian image? Why do you think we seem to be more comfortable writing about dystopian futures than, let's say, well-balanced, really, really quite good futures? Why do you think that's the case?
Well, it's kind of a multifaceted kind of thing. There is, from a purely pragmatic point of view, writing a crappy future is easier to generate conflict, which is basically the core of any storytelling is conflict. So it's a lot easier to write a crappy world because you can create a lot of conflict from it, create a lot of story ideas. That's from the pure pragmatic point of view. From a more personal perspective, I feel it kind of falls into a lot of people's cynicism, a lot of people's nihilism of how they see the world going. Because, like, when you look at a utopian future, people look at it and be like, oh, that's not going to happen, that's blah blah blah, because they see our world now. Whereas a dystopian future, you can actually, like, look at our world now and actually draw lines from there to there, and it just seems almost 100% realistic to a degree. Like, okay, yeah, I could see how this broke down, and the things that are now, they get worse. Like, to a lot of people, when you look at our world and you use that lens to view the future, a cyberpunk future feels like inevitable to a degree.
You made me think of something from one of my favorite authors, Herman Melville, who said I think in his novel Marty, he has a philosopher in that who says, far more people believe in hell than heaven.
It kind of reminds me of how, like, in Star Wars, the difference between the light and the dark side of the Force, where the light side is, controlling your emotions. It's let's just say it's about the power of positivity, while the dark side is, like, giving into your anger, your fear. And they say the dark side is easier, more seductive, but it is ultimately corrupting. Versus the light side, it's harder to maintain, but ultimately, one would say long-term more powerful. That's kind of up their debate, but, like, it's when you were talking about that, that's kind of reminded me of, like, giving into anger, emotion. Like, why do you think all these articles, they do hate bait, they do clickbait? Because they want to get people angry, because it's easy to get people riled up. And I remember fellow creators talking about doing clickbait, and I said, like, yeah, it's great for getting short-term stuff, but people get burnt out on clickbait. And we're kind of seeing that now, is why all these, like, Vice, Fox, and all these places are starting to kind of shutter down, because people are getting tired of this kind of rage bait articles.
Yeah, I actually just had this conversation in my classroom a couple of weeks ago. I asked my students, what do they think? What's the emotion that runs the social media platforms more than any other. And, God bless them. They were like good stories, happy stories. And I said, no, the research actually has shown that it's anger. Anger is the thing that keeps us continually engaged. And of course, like you said, you have stories like Star Wars and even, go back much further, Moby Dick and before that even shows how rage and anger can be something that actually fuels us continually. And there's always a draw to that energy that fuels us continually. But where does it lead? Well, self-destruction, ultimately. And I see no reason to stop believing that today.
I mean, I like to call it an eternal truth.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, yeah. Well, tell us a little bit then, like you did with Project Access. Tell us a little bit about where do you see or what can we expect of the Samurai 2100 world moving forward a little bit.
Mm-hmm. Well, so Torrent Samurai is, like you said, it's a little bit different. The stories are more standalone. They're like they kind of have their kind of monster of the week, but they also have kind of a plot that's going forward. Basically, Kiro's going to get settled into his new place. Tyler and him are going to go on adventures and whatnot. More of the world is going to be revealed. The enemy, that kind of thing.
Great. And Nick, I know we're short on time. You have, things that you have to do. Could you tell us a little bit about where people can look for your work, where they can find you as well?
Well, as far as my work, you can find it on Comixology and Global Comics. And Torrent Samurai, you can find as well on Amazon Kindle. And then as for me, I am on Instagram, Twitter. I have a Facebook, but I don't really use it. But so if you want to like the Project Access page, go ahead. Don't really post on it anymore. I got like 600 people, and I post something, I get like one like, so it's just kind of Yeah, but the best way to get a hold of me is tweet it. Is if you want to tweet at me how much I suck, just do a Twitter. I'll probably have and then Instagram I post a lot, so there's that too.
Great. And are there any final thoughts you want to leave the audience with?
I can only show you the door. You're the one who has to walk through it.
Very true. Well, Nick, thank you so much for joining us here.
It was a pleasure.
Well, I hope you've enjoyed my conversation with Nick Gibson. You can find links to Nick's work in the episode notes below, as well as various ways to contact him. If you found the conversation enjoyable, please consider subscribing and/or following the Neutral Ground podcast on your favorite podcast platform. Additionally, I also have a YouTube channel where I not only host episodes, but also host guest appearances of myself on other podcasts as well. So consider subscribing to that as well. And head on over to the neutralgroundpodcast.com, where you can leave me an email or an audio message to just let me know what you think of the show, and also anything that maybe it prompted you to think about in terms of the topic at hand. As always, keep one foot firmly planted on the neutral ground, and have a great day.